Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The U.S. fires on a ship in the Strait, but Pakistan signals peace. Welcome to the Tuesday edition as Pakistan's defense minister declares the U.S. and Iran are close to, quote, some sort of arrangement, unquote, over the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, they call it some sort of arrangement without any detail. All I know is the U.S. fired on a ship that tried to run the blockade today, a Panamanian flagged ship that probably regrets doing so.
Yeah, that's after, of course, that the U.S. blockade has also turned dozens of vessels around, vessels that complied with the order to do so, unlike this Panamanian vessel. And to your point on the vague nature of this statement from Pakistan, we're not sure what kind of arrangement we're talking about, what form or details could be contained in it. All we know, according to Pakistan, is that things are shaping up. This is a direct quote in favor of peace.
That's an interesting take on things because it doesn't appear to be that way on the surface, although the markets seem to be giving everyone the benefit of the doubt today. It's a bit of a pause across the board, slightly higher for oil, slightly lower for stocks, but no big moves here as we wait for signals from overseas. Chris Wright, the energy secretary, taking to Twitter to say what he told us on Balance of Power just a couple of days ago. About 9 million barrels appear to be getting through at least overnight on a daily basis here.
And that's through seaborne transit. He also talked about the millions of barrels in addition to that are being rerouted through pipelines, which, as you say, he did tell us in our latest interview with him. He says altogether about 15 million barrels a day are getting out of the Middle Eastern region. But of course, that's not back up to pre-war capacity. And it's not clear when, if ever, we're going to return to those levels, which has implications for the direction of gas prices. Ultimately may not go down ahead of November with the speed at which Republicans would prefer they do so.
Haven't seen the president yet today. Tyler Kendall's going to join us, though, from the White House, tell us what we have on tap. And we'll spend some time later with Marc Short, the Republican strategist who was once the liaison between the Trump administration in the first term and Capitol Hill, with a lot more to discuss today in Washington.
Yep, looking forward to that conversation. But first, we'll spend some time with Charlie Pellet checking on the markets up in New York. Charlie?
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. We've got the U.S. stock market trading lower. Oil is higher. Definitely mixed signals coming out of the Middle East. I do want to begin with hydrocarbons. West Texas Intermediate, 83 even a barrel now, up by just about 1%. Barrel of Brent, 88.53, up by 0.9%. Stocks lower right now. Traders, however, refraining from making big bets ahead of the CPI report tomorrow morning. Right now, the S&P 500 index, you're on the GIP screen on the Bloomberg, worst level of the day right now. We're down by just about 0.2%. We've got the Dow also down by 0.2%. NASDAQ, the composite index, down 0.5. NASDAQ 100 index down 0.4%. To be sure, though, yes, the S&P is down. Yes, it's at the worst level of the day, but still holding very close to a record. The Bloomberg Mag 7 index down 0.7%. The SOX, which is the Philadelphia Stock Exchange's semiconductor index, well off session highs, still holding on to a gain now of 0.4%. 2-year at 4.22% with the 10-year, 4.68%, the 30-year, 5.22%. Gold down 0.1%, 43.84 the ounce. Crude, as we mentioned, WTI 83.05 a barrel now, up by just about 0.1%. The oil super majors, they're all pushing higher. ExxonMobil up 0.1%. Chevron up by 0.8%. ConocoPhillips rallying today by 2%. California Attorney General Rob Bonta, in a post on X, is accusing Paramount Skydance of, quote, trying to blackmail the state following a report that CEO David Ellison is threatening to pull the company out of the state of California. Paramount Skydance shares down by 1%. Warner Brothers Discovery, which Paramount is trying to acquire, WBD up by 1.1%. Recapping, S&P down 21, dropped there 0.3%. Joe and Kailey, that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. Keeping an eye on the markets for us using the power of the Bloomberg terminal. You can use the power of the Bloomberg terminal to do a lot of things. I right now am looking at headlines on the terminal. I typed in Strait to see what headlines have come up in and around the Strait of Hormuz. And doesn't this tell a story in just the last couple days? August 4th, President Trump says the Strait is going to be open, quote, very soon. August 6th, President Trump says the Strait is sort of open now. On the same day, you have the president saying that the Strait is moving along good. Then Iran says yesterday, August 10th, that the reopening of the Strait requires that the U.S. end its naval blockade as well as payment of reparations. The very same day, President Trump, in the Oval Office, when questioned by our colleague Josh Wingrove, said that the Strait isn't sort of open or opening soon. It, in fact, is open right now.
Back to the subject of Iran, sir. Can you give us any estimate of when you think the Strait of Hormuz will be part of the deal?
Well, it's open now. We're taking a lot of ships. It's open now. Look, the only one that has control of the Strait of Hormuz right now is the United States Navy. We have a blockade that's been infallible. It's a steel wall. And we let people in that we want to let in, and those people come in, and they've been coming in and they're going out. So it's actually open now.
Iran says differently, that the Strait of Hormuz will remain shut until conditions are met, as we've heard before. But I'll point back to what Energy Secretary Chris Wright posted earlier. Thanks to the coordinated efforts of the military and our Gulf allies, the 7-day average for oil leaving the Strait of Hormuz is currently up to almost 9 million barrels a day. That's combined with the additional 5 to 7 million leaving the region by pipeline. Interesting sort of context for the comments that we're hearing from the President of the United States. Either way, as we were discussing earlier, a mediator, Pakistan, says we could be on the verge of peace. And that may be projecting. Let's go to the White House now with Tyler Kendall. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent is on the North Lawn, which looks a lot different than it did when Josh Wingrove joined us last evening in the throes of a lightning storm. Tyler, are we hearing anything new from the president today? Will he be before cameras at all before we're done?
Well, Joe, at this point, the president has a flurry of closed-door policy meetings on his schedule. The next one's set to start at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. But at this point, we haven't gotten indications that it will open up to the press. He is traveling to Ohio later tonight. We haven't gotten an update on exactly what time he will depart. That's for something known as the Patriot Games. He's going to this youth competition for the finale there. So maybe journalists will be able to catch him on camera as he gets on and off the plane. But at this point, we've gotten very little indication or detail on exactly what a potential breakthrough would look like. Because as you both went through, we really got headline whiplash today. Some more optimistic, Pakistan, of course, a key mediator in this, saying that Pakistani officials will be in Iran today when it comes to negotiations. But then publicly, both sides have really been digging into their positions, including the fact that President Trump has now laid this new demand on the table that Iran should be accountable for compensation for families of Iranian protesters who have died over the last 50 years, as well as to take responsibility for any death or damage related to conflicts in areas where its proxies operate across the region, whether that be Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, or Gaza. And that came in response to Iran saying that it was demanding compensation when it comes to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But Joe and Kailey, as you both know, that's a significant development because there had been conversations on the table about how to allocate funds to allow Iran to rebuild post-conflict, but that was considered to be a precondition for talks about potential curbs on Iran's nuclear program, not for reopening the Strait.
Well, as we look for a potential deal to reopen the Strait, any kind of deal between the U.S. and Iran or other parties in the Middle East, it seems that there might be a deal in the works as well between the United States and Canada. Tyler, some headlines just crossing from the CBC saying that Canadian and U.S. officials are aiming to present a new trade deal to President Trump as soon as next week. What do we know about this?
Well, Kailey, this is the CBC's reporting, but it's not necessarily surprising, and I'll tell you why. About 3 weeks ago, we had that threat from the White House of a 50% tariff on nearly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And at the time, our own analysts at Bloomberg Economics said that they expected these tariffs to be part of a negotiating tactic. Now, they were supposed to be implemented after 30 days. That deadline is next week, so that would coincide here with this reporting that we could see some sort of potential breakthrough when it comes to a trade negotiation between the two countries, keeping in mind that tensions really had been brewing between President Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister Marc Carney. President Trump last month threatening that he would even impose further tariffs when it comes to the wildfire smoke that was coming down from Canada. And last month we also saw the U.S. decline to renew the USMCA trade pact, setting up potentially years of tough negotiations. We'll see what's ultimately included in this deal, but the timing makes it feel like this is a strategic move by the U.S. when it comes to the sort of leverage that they put on the table to get some concessions from Canada.
And timing, as they say, is everything. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And as we consider the timing here, we're approximately, what, Joe, 84 days until the midterm elections as we speak here in Washington?
Yeah.
Yes, that is exactly. I just wanted to make sure my number was correct before I acted as if that was definitive, but it is definitive. 84 days to go. And when we consider the timing left to get resolution to some of these very issues we were talking about with Tyler, whether it's questions of tariffs or questions of peace in the Middle East and a conflict that has driven gas prices higher, the clock is ticking for those to trend more in the way of the incumbents in power here in Washington.
Well, that's for sure. And what's the conventional wisdom as people start making up their minds on Labor Day? A lot of the folks we speak with, pollsters, including Cliff Young, who was with us earlier today on Bloomberg, say that it's actually now. We don't need to wait until Labor Day, particularly in the face of the higher prices that we've been talking about every day, never mind the geopolitical confusion, the data centers. People are making their decisions as we speak.
I wonder if Marc Short agrees with that. He of
already
course,
made his decision.
is the former director of legislative affairs in the first Trump White House, also former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence. He's now chair of Advancing American Freedom, and he's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Nice to see you.
How y'all doing?
Always good to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As Joe says, our minds made up. Now, is it a question of Labor Day, or did things need to be resolved before everybody went on their final summer vacations?
I think that the traditional thought was around Labor Day, and by that point, I think the narrative gets set in. But I think it's earlier now. I don't think there's any mystery that the number one issue since Donald Trump was elected has been affordability, and that's still the number one issue. And I think that typically in modern American history, like last 50, 60 years, the party that is out of power gains about 21 seats in the midterm. But in the situations when you have one party in control of the White House, the House, and the Senate, it's typically about 40 in the last 50, 60 years, about 40-seat gain. And so certainly the Democrats right now have a lot of things going in their favor, and the affordability crisis remains the number one issue for American voters. The question will become, I think, how many trending socialist or near socialist candidates do the Democrats nominate that kind of curtail what could be an even bigger potentially win for them in November?
But is that your thought when you look at Wisconsin this evening? Francesca Hong, Thanksgiving, you're making it easier for us, is your thought?
I think absolutely, John. I think that, for her, I think that Tom Tiffany, if a Republican, will be a formidable candidate. And I think that she's just so far out the mainstream that they'll be giving the governor's mansion to Republicans in Wisconsin. But I think if you look in Congress, there's a continued push where there's been multiple Democratic socialists who have been nominated in the House. And you have some certainly outliers in the Senate, like El Said in Michigan, that I think create a narrative for Republicans that says, look at how far crazy the Democrats have become. And the Democrats are not really popular right now. And socialism is even less popular. So even though the president's numbers are down, it seems in many cases where Democrats are offering the alternative is not really what voters are looking for either.
Well, so I've been wondering here about the kind of pattern we are seeing where you saw, for example, people who were Obama voters became Trump-Pence voters in 2016 after voting for Obama. Previously, maybe some of them swung back to Biden, maybe some stuck with President Trump on the economic grounds you were talking about. Could we not see that extreme swing once again, if there is that kind of horseshoe theory of politics and the lines between socialism and populism maybe at sometimes blurred?
Well, Kailey, I think it's odd that in a Republican administration just a couple weeks ago, we had administration talking about price gouging and needing to go after Exxon and Chevron to lower gas prices.
And he wants to take stakes in, say, AI
You have
companies.
a record number of state-owned enterprises now in a Republican administration. You obviously have huge protectionist tariffs. And so to the horseshoe theory, I remember campaigning on the campaign trail in 2016, and there were a lot of signs of Bernie Sanders, yard signs, that became Trump signs. So when Hillary defeated Bernie, those voters came over to Trump. And there's no doubt that the president is flexing more of his populist economic message as opposed to the first administration conservative. And so you make a great point, is for a lot of voters who are looking for actually the government to get out of the economy, it's not as if Republicans are offering a clear contrast right now to Democrats.
When you consider the idea of 40 seats, though, going to Democrats, we talked to Susan Del Bene yesterday. The DCCC is just adding to the battleground map, and they added 12 more seats last week. French Hill, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Mike Flood was on there. Do we get to the point where, I know history matters, but Marc Short rolls his eyes at some of these.
I do, and in some cases, when you have that much momentum and you have a lot of resources to play with, you begin placing seats that just are for news stories. So people begin thinking, oh, the map could even be larger. I don't anticipate it being 40 because I think there's new challenges right now. For one, there's been so much redistricting that has favored Republicans mid-cycle right now that should gain Republicans a net of about 10 seats. But two, our districts are more there's fewer competitive districts today than there used to be. And so I do think that there's a lot of momentum Democrats have currently, but I think those headwinds are they're going to be shaving off some of that cap that they could have.
Well, as we consider the kind of notion of some of those districts that have been redistricting, you've been on this program before, Marc, talking about how that could actually backfire in some instances against Republicans because you're watering down districts that aren't as far deep red as they would have been otherwise. If this is even districts that are Trump plus 10, is this a safe year to assume that a Trump plus 10 district is going to go?
No, Kelly, you're right. I think it's about a plus 10 is where you actually have the cutoff line. And you're right that, in many cases, some of those lines are redrawn were in states like Texas. In Texas, it doesn't look as strong for Republicans right now because certainly the Paxton drama is weighing down a lot of Republicans across the state. So you're exactly right. You could see some of those redrawn seats that actually end up flipping for Democrats. Having said that, I still think that the redrawing districts will be a net gain for Republicans, but potentially not as significant as they thought it would be.
I'd love to ask you about what's happening or will happen on Capitol Hill when lawmakers come back. Senate went home last weekend. Everyone's gone through August. We know the deal here, but not a lot got done. In fact, a lot of things were left on the side of the road, including the Clarity Act, which we've talked about a lot. There are questions about what the House will do with the CR when it comes back around. How much order or disorder will we see after 5 weeks on the lam?
I would encourage you to continue to think not much will get done.
Okay, then.
Just as
low expectations.
The past will be the future as well.
No shutdown, though.
I think particularly when you're in an election year, members are really anxious to get home and go back to campaigning. So I would anticipate you will see a CR completed at this point, which I think was a question because I think that the shutdown actually in some ways benefited Democrats before. So I think there's a lot of question of would they pursue that same political strategy. It appears not this time. It appears that we will keep the government open, which is a positive. But I don't know how much more is really going to get done. You might see the Senate pass the Clarity Act, but actually getting to reconcile the two bills and get anything past that. And I think if you're looking at a bigger reconciliation 3.0, maybe a slim chance of that in a lame duck session, but I don't anticipate you seeing that in September either.
Wow, incredible.
What about be great news for the Pentagon?
Yeah, certainly so. What about the Russia sanctions bill that the Senate passed? Huge bipartisan margin, but is that necessarily a mandate for this House?
I think that the House will support it as well, Kay. I do think you've seen Democrats who want to curtail some of the tariff authority that's provided to the president under that bill. It feels to me that's kind of specific to Russia, but I do think you'll see the House change some of the bill, but I still think you're going to see it get to the president's desk.
It's great to have you back with us, as always. I hope your summer's going well.
Thanks for having me, guys.
It's almost over,
Good to see
by the
you.
way.
I
still
know.
Can't get over that.
Yeah.
Marc Short, chairman, Advancing American Freedom. And, of course, in his time at the White House in the first Trump administration, he was chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence and was the director of legislative affairs, connecting both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue for us. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. It is primary day. Happy primary day. We'll assemble our political panel next. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. With voting underway today in 6 states, we have to remember the special in South Carolina, what that might mean for the future of the late Lindsey Graham's Senate seat. It's all straight ahead on Balance of Power, only here on Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We are looking at the S&P 500 index trading at just about the low of the day right now. Very slight bounce off the bottom, now lower by 0.3%. To be sure, S&P holding close to a record right now, though people reluctant to make big bets until we find out tomorrow morning what that CPI report will bring. It drops 8:30 a.m. and you can have complete details as the number breaks and react action right here on Bloomberg. S&P again down 21. Right now a drop of 0.3%. Dow Industrials lower by 0.2%. Nasdaq down 0.6%. Nasdaq 100 index down 0.4, and to be sure, S&P holding close to a record. 2-year yield at 4.22% with the 10-year 4.68%. We do have the 30-year 5.23%. Gold down $9 the ounce. Little change there, down 0.2%. 43.81 the ounce. Crude up 1.4% right now, 83.28 a barrel on WTI. Brent 88.80 up by 1.2%. Oil resuming its advance again today as traders assess the latest developments from the Middle East. Intel is raising $20 billion in an upsized share sale. That's a third more than it was targeting when it announced the deal yesterday morning. Today, Intel shares down by 0.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Joe and Kailey, that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. Checking the markets for us on this Tuesday. And not just any Tuesday. Once again, it is a primary Tuesday here in the U.S. across 6 different states, with a few races in particular in focus as we look for signals on the future direction of the Democratic Party. Could we see echoes of what we saw in Michigan last week with the victory of progressive Abdul El-Sayed, in the Wisconsin gubernatorial primary, where Democratic Socialist Francesca Hong does look like she could ultimately come out victorious in the vote today? There's questions as well in the Democratic Senate primary in Minnesota, trying to vie for the seat being vacated by Democratic Senator Tina Smith. You have a more progressive candidate in Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan up against a moderate in Congresswoman Angie Craig. There are other races we're watching as well. The My Pillow guy is running for governor in Minnesota. President Trump is backing him. I'm not sure how far his endorsement could go ultimately in that race, or how far, frankly, it will go in the race happening in South Carolina today, the Republican primary to fill the seat permanently vacated by the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Of course, currently his sister Darlene Graham is in that seat, and she is running for it on a long-term basis.
Is Lindell TV covering the campaign of the My Pillow guy?
Conflict of interest, but I don't know how much that matters.
I haven't seen. We want to get to our political panel because there's a lot to talk about here. You just framed the 2 states most important for primaries with regard to this whole Democratic Socialist narrative, Minnesota and Wisconsin. We're also deeply curious, though, about this special in South Carolina, because it does look like it's going to a runoff. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis join us now. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy Center's Ash School, and Rick is our Republican strategist partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne, I know you're looking at these states as well, and we've heard a heck of a lot over the past couple of weeks about Francesca Hong. She's become a household name because of her commentary on Thanksgiving, which, by the way, she has recanted. I guess she's going to keep the holiday in place here. But she's up against a moderate Democrat, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, and this is the latest example of what we've been talking about so much. What will it mean for Democrats if she wins?
You know, I think, first of all, we have to be very cautious, as we all talked about, looking at the Michigan polls and how El-Sayed pulled it out by a much narrower margin. So while some of these primary polls have her winning with double digits, I don't know if we can trust those primary polls. Very hard to poll these things. And of course, this has been a really tough election season for the establishment in the Badger State. I mean, David Crowley was in the race, got out of the race, jumped back in the race with the of urging of the governor, Tony Evers. Hong has stayed in it. Hong has been on the cutting edge of many issues, including data centers, which we talk a lot about. She's been out front there. And interestingly, she has spent so much less money than any of her competitors. Like Tom Tiffany on advertising is at like over $7 million. She's under $400,000. And David Crowley, just in July, doubled her spending. And why can she do that and still be number one? Because number one, she's getting support from the Republicans who want to see her win this primary. Number two, because she's going outside of a traditional sort of television spending. So it's been a fascinating race. I think it's going to be tough for her to pull it through. She hasn't even had the endorsements of Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Hassan Piker, and all of those other sort of well-known socialists, if you will. So it's going to be a tough race for her. I would not be surprised whoever won but both sides have issues in the Democratic side.
Yeah, Rick, I wanted to ask you about that. Do you read into the lack of endorsement from those key progressive players like Senator Bernie Sanders? Because Francesca Hong's campaign is writing it off as this isn't a race for a seat in Congress or the Senate. This is a state race.
No, I mean, Bernie Sanders would be all over this race if he thought she has a credible candidate. And I don't know if it's about her views around Thanksgiving. There are some years where the deep fried turkey that I made kind of put a spoil on Thanksgiving, and there are probably people who felt the same way she did. But that's just me. The reality of it is she's not a great candidate. She hasn't really committed herself to the race in a way that serious candidates do. And I would remind everybody, the only reason Crowley was in and out was because Sarah Ferguson, who was lieutenant governor, totally screwed up her own campaign and malfeasance around the funding of it. And so, yeah, this is a campaign that's had a lot of stumbles. But look, what's not stumbling? The Republican nominee, Tom Tiffany, assuming after today he's the nominee, $13 million in the bank. It's only been 6 years since Scott Walker left the governorship. And Trump, won Wisconsin by 49%. I mean, this is a state a Republican can win. So I know there's a lot of focus on, another DSA candidate running, that could win in the primary. And I agree with Jeanne. These polls have all been more wrong than right on these, especially statewide primaries. And I wouldn't be surprised if, we're talking about Republican governor in Wisconsin, even in one of the worst years for Republicans that we're going to have seen in a long time.
Well, that's saying a lot, Rick. I'm curious your thoughts on South Carolina. We talked a lot about Lindsey Graham when he passed away, and the choice that the president made to put his sister in place. Now Senator Darlene Graham is going to find out what a Trump endorsement is worth in South Carolina. She's up against some pretty well-known folks, including Ralph Norman, the Freedom Caucus Republican congressman, been on this program many times and is well-known in the state. Rick, the conventional wisdom is this goes to a runoff. Do you believe that's the case? And is it a name recognition issue for Darlene Graham?
Yeah, I mean, this is a race where you really don't have any polling data to speculate on whether it's right or wrong. And so the reality is, it's exactly what you said, Joe. Does Donald Trump's endorsement put somebody over the top? I think in the Emerson poll that was taken before everybody really got in the race, 46% said they would go with a Trump endorsement. That's still not 51%, which you need to avoid a runoff. So I think that puts Darlene in the runoff. It's just who's going to go with her. Ralph Norman, he's been in the news a lot over the last couple of years. A once and future politician, Mark Sanford is in this race. He could overperform. I mean, there are a lot of people in that down ticket who could surprise folks. But the bottom line is, then what does the state look like when you got a one-on-one in 2 weeks to run an election? And I'd still say advantage Darlene Graham at that point with the weight of the administration and the governor behind her.
Does the weight of the administration and the president go as far if you're the former CEO and founder of MyPillow, Jeanne? Mike Lindell is running for governor in Minnesota. The president is backing him. He took to True Social to reiterate again this morning that he hopes Mike Lindell wins big in Minnesota this evening. A big win, he said, he deserves, even if he is able to pull it off in the primary, which polling doesn't necessarily suggest he will. Would he stand a chance against Senator Amy Klobuchar, the Democratic nominee, presumptively?
Yeah, that would be a very tough race for Republicans win. To your point, Kailey, even if the Pillow Man, as I like to call him, does indeed win, Minnesota, very tough for the GOP. In the same way, I would say that South Carolina, which Rick can correct me, I think Lindsey Graham used to say could also be called Trumpistan, is very tough for Democrats, regardless of who wins. But both of these races are really testing Donald Trump's endorsement power. And to your point, he's gone all in. But South Carolina is fascinating because don't forget, last time around, he endorsed 2 candidates. So if this goes to a runoff, I wouldn't be surprised if he does the same.
All right, I'll take this seriously for a minute. Rick, Mike Lindell at the Minnesota Farm Fest told the crowd in the big barn set up there that he has the edge on the rest of the field. Quote, "I can call up and work with the president of the United States, unquote. Is that actually worth something?
Yeah, I mean, relationship with Donald Trump's gotten a lot of Republicans through primaries, usually through an endorsement. And I think that has to go here, too, right? I mean, we have to assume that, his relationship with the president, which is notorious, is got to be an advantage. That being said, most of the polling in the state shows he's the weakest Republican candidate against Amy Klobuchar, who, like, if you actually thought about, gee, we'd like a Republican to win, he'd be your last choice. I think, there'll be a lot of head scratching on election night tonight when if he wins, and a lot of a rolling of eyes on the Democratic side if he doesn't.
I think you were saying earlier, Kailey, imagine the debate between Lindell and Klobuchar. Surely he'd show up with graphs and an easel of some sort.
And a pillow?
Maybe a pillow.
Maybe. Although we should note he is no longer the CEO, still on the board,
well,
but he's no longer the chief executive because he wanted to focus on the campaign. The campaign could end tonight. It maybe will not. Jeannie, the other race we're watching in that same state, Minnesota, is the race to be the next senator replacing the Democrat Tina Smith. You have the Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who's backed by the likes of Elizabeth Warren. She's the more progressive candidate. Then you have the moderate in Congresswoman Angie Craig. How much of a tell could this also be on the trajectory of your party?
I do think it is going to be interesting because Angie Craig, of course, when she won, she was more of a centrist. She had to be at the time she ran and won. And now she's being, called to the mat by Flanagan about things like the Lincoln Riley Act, her vote for that. She's trying to walk that back. And a lot of discussion, obviously, in this race about issues of immigration. So I do think this will be fascinating to see if Flanagan can pull this off. But like in so many of these races, I think for voters on the ground, the more the establishment Democrats try to say, we should be selected because we are electable in November, because Flanagan, or if you look at Hong, 5 years ago, they said something that was, quite bizarre about Thanksgiving. That really falls flat for many people on the ground in a Donald Trump's era, when it seems like people are saying all kinds of things on social media with no repercussions, and the Democratic establishment can't even get their own candidates over the line. And so that's where I think they have to really do a better job, this establishment, speaking to this progressive wing of the party.
All right, Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg politics contributors in our political panel today. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Just getting word from Colombia's finance ministry that Colombia's government plans to declare an economic emergency to bolster its response to that massive earthquake. Death toll over 180 right now. An emergency order would give Colombia's president, who began his 4-year term last Friday, temporary authority to issue economic and tax decrees without the need for congressional approval. Stocks are trading lower. S&P 500 index, very slight bounce off the bottom, but still down 20 points. Right now, the S&P is at 7732, down by about 0.3%. We do have the CPI report tomorrow morning. A lot of people holding off bets until that number drops at 8:30 a.m. Wall Street time. Bottom line here, S&P 500 index, again, is trading close to a record, a loss right now of just about 0.2%. The Dow down 92, Dow Industrials down 0.2%. NASDAQ is down 147 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop now of 0.5%. The 10-year 4.22%, the 10-year 4.68%, the 2-year 4.22%, the 30-year 5.23%. Gold down $14 the ounce, $43.77, down by about 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude, as oil traders keep an eye on developments in and around the Strait of Hormuz. 83.17, we're up 1.3% on WTI. Barrel of Brent, 88.74, up by about 1.2%. On holding shares are plunging after it posted disappointing second quarter sales as the Swiss brand held off from discounting older shoe models ahead of product updates in the highly promotional U.S. market. On holding, backed by tennis legend Roger Federer, On is down now by 20%. Recapping, S&P down 18 points, drop there of 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. Kailey and Joe, that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Charlie Pellet will be back from World Headquarters in New York at the top of the hour with another check on the markets, 2 p.m. Eastern, as we kick off Bloomberg Business Week Daily. Here on Balance of Power, we've got our eyes on the Middle East with the phrase close to some sort of arrangement making news today from Pakistan, where the defense minister said things are shaping up in favor of peace. Of course, Pakistan is a mediator in talks, sometimes indirect talks, with Iran, Kailey, but we're accentuating the positive here today, even though the United States fired on a ship in the Strait. It was a Panamanian flagged vessel that made a run at the blockade. Unclear if that was tied to anything else that we're looking at here. But some oil is getting through. The president said yesterday the Strait is open, and that appears to still not be the case.
Yeah, of course, the blockade is still in effect, as evidenced by that vessel being fired on and the dozens of vessels CENTCOM says it has turned around in enforcement of this. And of course, Iran has also suggested repeatedly that that blockade needs to end, and perhaps even war reparations need to be paid by the United States for the Strait to reopen fully. So it's not exactly clear where we go from here. But let's try to figure out as much as we can with Ian Marlowe, who's joining us now in studio. He's our national security editor here at Bloomberg. So, Ian, if things are going in the direction of peace, I guess we read that as a positive, but do we know the kind of velocity with which we're heading in that direction?
No, we don't. And this was not necessarily on the bingo card for today. We saw a lot of harsh words flying back and forth yesterday between Trump and some Iranian officials after there were some appointments over the weekend in Iran where they were kind of signaling that they were taking a harder line on their control of Hormuz. And on their insistence on compensation for the war, which Trump on Monday said was the first time it's ever been brought up, but was actually in the MOU that the two sides agreed to in June, where there was that $300 billion fund. So that kicked off this huge thing yesterday where it was, you know, you pay reparations for this, and then Trump started saying you have to pay reparations to everyone who's been killed in attacks from Iran over the years. You have to pay reparations to people in Lebanon and Syria. All these things that were obviously non-starters for Iran. And so to have a Pakistani mediator come out today and say that we're getting close to some kind of deal is a bit strange, especially since Qatar has been more recently the sort of more involved mediator, where obviously Pakistan hosted some talks earlier on in the process that didn't end up going anywhere. So it's not clear how much we need to invest in the Pakistani defense minister's words today, but they have moved oil markets because everyone is still sensitive to some deal kind of coming forward.
We know that we cannot often believe what we're hearing from Iran, particularly when it comes to the status of talks. What motivates Pakistan in this case to project this kind of optimism?
Yeah, I think for Pakistan and for Qatar more, people actually just do want stability in the region. They want this sort of low-lying, low level of conflict that just doesn't end. They want that over. For Pakistan, I think Pakistan has in some ways parlayed it has played the Trump administration very well in the sense of, I don't mean play as in kind of getting a fast one over on them, but they have, they've been very complimentary towards the president. They have inserted themselves into this process and gotten a lot of prestige. There were a lot of, hot takes earlier on during the war about, Pakistan's growing role in international affairs, which is not something, you would have thought you would see. So I think Pakistan has some actual benefit to get from inserting itself into the process. But in general, I think the mediators are trying to push this along. And anytime you see Iran and the U.S. getting, drifting further into this irreconcilable, just red lines all over the place sort of situation, the mediators kind of crop up and say, oh, there's a diplomatic process going on, we're moving towards, talks are still ongoing, they're not over. And it gets everyone sort of back on track again. It's also not clear how much some of this is posturing, either on the U.S. side or the Iranian side. There's The U.S. has constantly referred to fragmentation within the Iranian government about hardliners and moderates and who wants what. And in the U.S., Trump has gone from threats of escalation to talks are happening to a deal is close within a matter of hours sometimes. So it's not clear exactly, which is a situation we've been in now for several months, I think.
Yeah, frequently more questions than answers when we talk. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. Ian Marlowe, Bloomberg News National Security Editor. As we prepare to spend some time with Morgan Ortagus, we recall the comments last evening from Heather Conley, joined us on the late edition of Balance of Power. Of course, with the American Enterprise Institute, she's a senior fellow, talking about the list of options facing the president right now, dwindling to none. Listen.
The president does not have good options. So right now, I think the message is, I'm not messaging to the Iranians that they have the leverage now. I am not going to make a decision yet. I'm going to hope that something pressures Iran to take a different step. But this was really downplaying. And you heard that with Secretary Bessent as well, saying, the Strait of Hormuz is really not that important. They'll have other ways to get energy out of the region. So no decision is a decision in a strategy, and we're in a holding pattern right now until something gives.
Let's hear from a voice of experience in Morgan Ortagus. Was Steve Witkoff's deputy U.S. special envoy, left the administration in March, former State Department spokesperson, and we should note currently enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserves. Morgan, it's great to see you. Thank you as ever for your service, and I'm curious your thoughts today with Iranian state media reporting that Iran has closed the Strait. On one hand, Pakistan is telling us on the other that, once again, we're on the verge of peace. Which do you see as more realistic?
Maybe all of the above. Listen, going into these negotiations, I can tell you, being a part of Steve's team, last year, before we ended up doing the bombing in June of 25, there were negotiations that were started. And so what you often see, we must have had 20 different countries reaching out to us, asking us to be a part of the negotiations to help facilitate. So I'm not sure what's going on with the Pakistanis today. It may be a cry for relevance so far in the negotiations. I actually, though, I think I disagree with the woman that you had on from AEI that said the president is sort of out of options or in a holding pattern. I actually see it from an entirely different perspective. I was nervous about the war over the summer. I'm at a much more peaceful state now because I think the president is doing what he did in his first term that actually worked really well against Iran. And that was in the first term, we had the maximum economic pressure campaign against Iran. We have that now, plus a naval blockade. So while the IRGC likes to make these large and loud protestations about the Strait and what they're doing and not doing, the undisputable fact is nothing is going into Iranian ports or from Iranian ports. That blockade is incredibly effective. It works. It's important. We're still seeing Axios, I believe, reported about 8 million barrels per day that are going through the Straits. Plus, you have 8.5 in some of the overland methods. As you just reported earlier, the price of oil, I think, is in the lower 80s. I mean, when we were looking at the Biden midterms, for example, in 22, the price of oil was higher than this. So I actually think that the president is in the best spot that he's been in this entire year. Inflation is through the roof in Iran. Young people don't have jobs. People can't buy basic needs. And what is this regime most scared of? They're scared of their own people and their protests.
Well, so if maximum economic pressure is ultimately the answer here in your mind, Morgan, it begs the question of why we launched a hot war in the first place. Why didn't we just do this from the very beginning if it's enough?
So I don't think it's enough, and I don't think it's our only option. And I think military force is incredibly important. Why is that? What were the headlines that we heard for the last 4 years leading up to the Trump administration for the 4 years of Biden? I was constantly reading that Iran was weeks away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. They were charging forward. I mean, the world, and by the way, the people that were the most aggressive in that time, especially when we entered office last year, were the E3. France, Germany, UK. It was our European partners. When I came in, I swore in 15 minutes after the president on January 20th, 2025. And it was our European allies that were sounding the alarm to us about the seriousness of how close Iran was from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And we knew that we were going to have to quickly negotiate. And if that didn't work, take kinetic action, which the president took in June. So there's never one sure thing that works. Like I know you and your listeners, you're used to, a company that says, here's how we're going to get to our projected revenue goal, our earnings goal, and here's the plan. Foreign policy and national security can be very opaque. It can be very gray. And you normally have to look at a series of options and judge it by the day and the week. So I think that the president's military campaign was important. We no longer see the headlines that Iran is close to a nuclear weapon. President Trump was the first president to say that Iran would never get a nuclear weapon on his watch. And he was the first president to actually take serious action for that to happen. So I guess, this whole narrative that the administration is sort of on its back heels with Iran, for me as an analyst and as someone who's been a part of these negotiations, I don't see it at all. I think the president is actually in the catbird seat, not the Iranian regime. I mean, they can't even establish proof of life of the supreme leader. It's like weekend at Mushabas.
So when does Steve Witkoff get back at a table? Actually just saw that movie last weekend. When does Steve Witkoff get back at a table, or does this indirect negotiation through the likes of Pakistan and Qatar continue indefinitely?
It could continue indefinitely. I think that the administration is exhibiting and the president is exhibiting a lot of patience right now. And I do think strategic patience is on our side. The president has been clear that all military options are still on the table. CENTCOM is still aggressive. It's still there. It's still enforcing the naval blockade. It's the U.S. Treasury is still enforcing the sanctions. And every day that goes by that Iran doesn't have a deal, they are hurt economically. Now, an important and crucial point, economic pain will not necessarily change the behavior of the people that Steve Witkoff is negotiating with. Economic pain probably won't even change the behavior of the IRGC. However, economic pain does change the behavior of what I mentioned earlier, of what the IRGC is most scared of, is most fearful of. It's not any foreign military. It's not America or Israel. They're most scared of their own people. And the economy today is, of course, much
but Morgan,
worse
if I could jump in there, wasn't that the narrative at the beginning when the president announced the launch of major combat operations? He said it was the time of the Iranian people to rise up. That didn't happen. Why would it happen now? What has changed?
Well, it did happen in January, which is why we actually started.
Right, I'm talking post the launch of Epic Fury.
Because you can't really predict this stuff in foreign policy. I mean, listen, I actually said on Bloomberg a few days after Assad fell, and none of us were predicting that. Thank you. I've been going on your network for a while, and I remember that very vividly, that was just not a day that we were all predicting. So these things happen in foreign policy. You can't really predict when the people are going to rise up and take on a regime. But what you can ensure is that the people who terrorize, the IRGC who terrorizes the Iranian people, you can make sure that they don't have extra money in their quivers in order to continue to terrorize their own people. And that's one of the goals of this economic campaign.
All right, we'll leave it there. Morgan Ortagus, thank you so much for joining us once again on Balance of Power, the former Deputy U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East alongside Steve Witkoff. We appreciate you joining us on this early edition, and we'll be back for more on the late edition at 5 p.m. Eastern. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week Daily is just ahead right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.